Welcome to Revenge Threads. I'm really curious. What country are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. When I first met Ethan, I wasn't looking for anything serious. I'd just come out of a toxic relationship, and the last thing I wanted was to get tangled up in another man's expectations. But Ethan wasn't like the others. He was kind, quietly brilliant, and had this way of looking at me that made me feel like I mattered. Not just as a woman, but as a person. I fell hard. And fast. He was originally from Norway but had moved to the US on a work visa a few years back. His accent was soft and melodic, his mannerisms precise. My southern roots couldn't have been more different. Born and raised in Georgia, church every Sunday, ma'am, and sir, drilled into my vocabulary before I could spell. Ethan and I came from two separate worlds, but when we were together it felt like home. After 6 months of dating, he gently suggested that it was time to meet my parents. I hesitated. Not because I wasn't proud of him, I was. But because I knew exactly what was waiting on the other side of that door. My father, Harold, was complicated. The kind of man who believed in the good old days and wasn't shy about saying so, especially when he'd had a couple of whiskeys. He had always imagined me marrying a good southern boy, preferably someone who played football in high school and owned a gun safe. Ethan didn't fit that mold. So Ethan deserved honesty. I explained as delicately as I could that my father could be difficult, close-minded, even bigoted. Ethan listened quietly, and then in that calm way of his, he smiled and said, "Then let's give him the chance to meet someone different." The night of the introduction, I could barely breathe. We pulled into my childhood driveway, a ranch-style house with a flagpole out front and a pickup in the garage. My mom, of course, was already on the porch, apron on, waving like everything was perfect. And for the first 15 minutes it was. Ethan brought a bottle of wine. My mother gushed about how tall he was. Dad grunted and shook his hand, but at least he didn't say anything offensive. Not at first. Then came the football game. It was college season, and Dad wasn't about to miss the Bulldogs play. We all gathered in the living room. Beer in hand, my dad hollered at the screen like the players could hear him. Ethan sat politely, nodding along even though he didn't know a touchdown from a home run. Then it happened. One of the running backs, a young black player, made an incredible play. And my father, without hesitation, shouted something I can't bring myself to repeat. A word so foul it stained the air. Ethan's eyes widened, not in fear but in disgust. I froze. My mother tried to laugh it off. "Oh, Harold, hush now." I wanted to crawl into the floorboards. We didn't stay much longer. I mumbled something about needing to get back early, and Ethan followed without protest. On the ride home he was silent. I was terrified I'd lose him right then and there. Instead, he reached over, took my hand and said, "You are nothing like them." I cried. What Ethan didn't know, what I hadn't even realized yet, was that moment would be the beginning of something much bigger. Because no matter how hard I tried to keep peace between the man I loved and the family I came from, my father wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And one day, years later, Ethan would make him pay for every single word. By the time Ethan and I had been together for nearly 2 years, I knew I wanted to marry him. I also knew exactly what that meant, facing my father. In our little southern town, traditions die hard. One of them being that no man proposes to a woman without first asking her father's permission. I wasn't particularly tied to the idea, but Ethan, being the respectful man he is, said he wanted to do it right. Even if the man in question had made it very clear on multiple occasions that he didn't consider Ethan a real American. We both dreaded the call. Still, Ethan picked a weekend when my dad was likely to be in a decent mood. No football games, no birthdays to hijack. He dialed the number and stepped onto our apartment balcony while I sat inside chewing my nails. When he came back in, his expression said it all. "He refused to meet with me," Ethan said simply. Said he was too busy. But we both know what that means. I nodded. My heart hurt for him. For us. It didn't stop there. The next day my father called me. Not Ethan. Me. He started off with a lecture about men who marry for papers and foreigners who want to weasel their way in through sweet-talking southern girls. I was stunned. For all his small-mindedness, this was a new low. I tried to defend Ethan, but my father wasn't hearing it. "You're gonna regret this," He's just after your green card, baby. The irony, of course, is that Ethan had already been living and working in the States for years, earning more than most locals, and had never once brought up citizenship. If anything, I had joked about marrying for a passport. But my father wasn't interested in facts, only fear. When Ethan heard what my father had said, he didn't get angry. He got quiet. "That man," he said finally, "doesn't know who I am. But someday he'll see." I thought it was just a line, a way to comfort me. I didn't know he meant it literally. We got married 6 months later. No lavish wedding, no family, just us on a beach with a few close friends. My mother cried when we told her we were eloping. My father didn't even return my call. They didn't come to the wedding. And honestly, it was perfect. For the next 2 decades, we lived our lives, had kids, traveled, built careers. Ethan became a US citizen in his own time. We even moved back to Georgia eventually, though I kept my distance from my father, especially when the kids were young. He never changed. Every visit was laced with microaggressions, sometimes not so micro. He'd introduce Ethan as the foreigner, and once when our son got a summer tan, he muttered something about mixing bloodlines. Ethan never flinched. He smiled, shook hands, passed the sweet tea, and kept all the receipts. Literally. So when Ethan decided to order DNA kits for the whole family, I didn't question it. It was just a curious hobby, or so I thought. But Ethan had something else in mind. Something that would change everything. And finally, teach my father the one thing he refused to learn his whole life. Who you are isn't always who you think you are. When the DNA kits arrived in the mail, I was mildly amused, not suspicious. Ethan had always been curious about ancestry, especially as someone who lived between cultures. He ordered tests for all of us, even the kids, and set them up with meticulous care. I remember him smiling, holding up the swabs like a magician prepping for a trick. "Let's see what secrets your roots are hiding," he joked. I didn't know how right he was. We all sent in our samples. Ethan used his email for his results, our oldest daughters and our sons. I created one for mine. We marked the calendar for the expected return date. I barely gave it another thought. Until Ethan came into the kitchen a few weeks later, holding a printed chart in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. "You've got to see this," he said, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. I peered over his shoulder. Scandinavian, Irish, English. No surprises for him. Then he flipped to our daughter's results. It matched Ethan's side almost perfectly. But our son? He pointed to a small percentage. Just 2%. Congolese, he said. I blinked. What? He didn't look at me like I'd done something wrong. Just curious. Come. I thought maybe it was a testing error or a weird fluke, he said. So I checked yours. My stomach turned. You got mine? You sent it to your email, he replied gently. But you forgot to log out of the account. I knew before he said anything else. I felt it deep in my bones. You're 8% Congolese, he said softly. And, well, guess who's the reason our son has his beautiful curls? I was stunned. I'd never thought of myself as anything but white. Growing up in a town where diversity meant one Italian family moving in, no one ever questioned lineage. My parents traced their roots back to Civil War soldiers and told stories about English settlers. There was never talk of Africa, not even a whisper of it. Suddenly, my whole family tree felt different. But more than that, I knew exactly what this meant. For him. For my father. Ethan didn't say it, but I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a loaded weapon, and my father had handed him the trigger years ago. He gave me a choice. Do you want to tell them? He asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked for a few days to sit with it. I reread my results, researched DNA markers, even texted my cousin who'd once traced our genealogy. I asked if she ever came across anything surprising. She hesitated, said she'd heard a rumor once about a great-great-grandmother but had dismissed it. That night, I sat beside Ethan in bed and whispered, "Let's tell him." He didn't gloat, didn't rub it in. He simply nodded. And then said something that sent chills down my spine. "Let's do it during college football night." It was my father's favorite time of year. Every Saturday, he'd invite us over to yell at the TV and grill burgers. It was the one time he played at being a family man. He never saw it coming. But he was about to. College football night at my parents' house was practically a national holiday. My dad would start the smoker at 7 a.m., crank his team's anthem through the backyard speakers, and wear that same faded college sweatshirt he'd owned since the 80s. He called it tradition. I called it tired. This Saturday, though, was different. We arrived early, Ethan, the kids, and me, like we always did. Dad greeted Ethan with a grunt and a beer and gave our kids a side hug without looking up from his grill. It was the same lukewarm reception I'd gotten used to. But tonight, I wasn't just here to play nice. I was here to flip the script. Ethan had a manila envelope in his coat pocket. I had a backup copy in my purse just in case. We had practiced the plan like a script, and the kids knew their lines, especially our son. He'd insisted on it. As the game kicked off, the room was its usual mess of snacks, shouting, and beer cans. My dad screamed at the TV when a black quarterback fumbled. "That boy runs like a damn monkey," he muttered, then glanced at Ethan as if expecting a laugh. Ethan didn't blink, just sipped his beer. That was the final straw. Our son, seated cross-legged on the floor with a bowl of popcorn, turned his head and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm 2% Congolese, Grandpa." The room fell silent. You could hear the announcers on the TV struggling to recover from the last play. "What?" my dad asked, slowly turning toward him. I said, "I'm part African," my son said again, this time with a proud smile. "From the Congo." Dad shot a look at me, then Ethan, as if we just told him we'd bought the house next door and planned to open a vegan food truck in his driveway. "That's not funny," he growled. "It's not a joke," I said, pulling the folder from my purse. "It's science." I laid the DNA printouts on the coffee table. Ethan's, mine, our children's. Full color, bold markers, side-by-side comparisons. Ethan leaned forward. Calm, patient, precise. "These are our results," he said. "Our son's heritage comes from my wife. Not me." My dad's face twisted into something between confusion and rage. He reached for the papers like they might catch fire in his hands. "Where the hell did you get this?" he barked. "Ancestry testing," Ethan said. "It's accurate. And repeatable." He read the charts like they were in Latin. He didn't understand half of what was printed, but he could see the highlighted words. Congolese, Nigerian. My father dropped the papers as if they'd burned him. "No daughter of mine." "Too late for that," I snapped. "Because your daughter, the one you raised, the one who watched you sneer at anyone different, isn't who you thought she was." He opened his mouth again, but Ethan cut him off. "We're not here for a debate. We're here so you understand something. Your racism, your comments, all that ignorant garbage you've spewed for decades, you've been directing that at your own blood, at your own grandkids, at your own daughter." Dad stood up, fists clenched, looking like he was ready to throw someone through a window. But Ethan didn't flinch. And I didn't either. The kids looked calm. My daughter held her little brother's hand. My mother entered the room holding a tray of cookies, completely oblivious to the emotional mushroom cloud in the center of her living room. My dad stared at the papers one last time. "Bullshit," he muttered and stormed out the back door, slamming it behind him. My mother blinked. "Did I miss something?" Ethan smiled at her. "Just a little family heritage lesson." We stayed just long enough to watch my father fume outside, pacing like a man whose world had cracked open beneath his feet. He never said another word that night. But from that day forward, he never mentioned where I came from again. Never called Ethan a foreigner. Never complained about the dark-skinned players on his TV. Turns out, a little DNA can rewrite a whole damn legacy. And I had the receipts to prove it. The car ride home that night was strangely calm. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other in mine. The kids were quietly playing a game on their tablets in the back seat, but I could feel their occasional glances at us. Little flickers of pride, like they knew they'd just witnessed something important. Something permanent. "You did good," Ethan said, finally breaking the silence. "You were strong." I wasn't alone. I said, squeezing his hand, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it anymore. When we pulled into our driveway, our porch light blinked on automatically, a mundane little detail that somehow reminded me how far I'd come from the girl who once begged for her father's approval. I didn't need his validation anymore. I had a family who saw me, really saw me, and I had finally reclaimed my own voice in a house that had silenced it for far too long. The next morning, the fallout began. I woke to missed calls from my mother and a handful of messages that started innocent enough. "Can we talk? You upset your father. Please don't bring up the DNA again." But then came the one that made my stomach turn. "Your father thinks Ethan manipulated you into all this." I showed Ethan the text. He just shook his head, not even surprised. "He can't handle the truth. He's scrambling for control," he said. "But he's not getting it back." I decided not to reply. Instead, I called my sister-in-law, who had become my biggest ally over the years. She answered on the first ring. "Girl, you shook him," she laughed. "He spent all morning mumbling about fake science and tried to convince us that ancestry tests are part of a liberal conspiracy." I let out a bitter laugh. "Of course he did. But your mom..." She hesitated. She looked cracked, like it finally hit her what he's been saying around the grandkids all this time. That made me pause. "She didn't say much," my sister-in-law continued. "But when your dad stormed off after church, she stayed behind. Just sat there, like she was waiting for something." "I wonder if she even knew," I said quietly, "about the Congo ancestry, about her side of the family. If she didn't, she does now." Later that week, a letter arrived. Not a text, not a voicemail, an actual handwritten letter, with my full name in my mother's careful cursive on the envelope. Inside was a note that read, "I didn't know. I truly didn't know. Your father never would have wanted to believe it anyway. But you, and your children, you deserve better. I'm sorry I didn't protect you when I should have." There were no flowers, no dramatic overtures, but the letter was folded around a photo, an old sepia portrait of a woman I didn't recognize. On the back, in faded pen, were the words, "Grandma Lottie, 1927. Her skin was deep bronze. Her eyes were my eyes." I stared at her face for a long time. My roots ran deeper than I ever knew, and they were beautiful. And suddenly, I didn't care if my father ever accepted that. I wasn't living for him anymore. I was living for her, for my kids, for the future. I slipped the photo into a frame and placed it on our mantle, right next to our family picture. My family, built on truth, backed by blood, and absolutely unstoppable. A week passed, and with it came a new kind of silence. Not the painful one I had known growing up, the one filled with tension and unsaid resentment. This silence was different. It was intentional, chosen. It was the first time I realized how freeing it felt to not chase after the approval of people who only ever gave it conditionally. My father didn't call, didn't text. My mother sent one more message, short and timid. "He's still not speaking to anyone. He says he's disappointed." I stared at the text, then deleted it. Disappointed? Disappointed was what I used to feel every time I made straight A's and still didn't get a good job, because I hadn't smiled enough while doing it. Disappointed was every family dinner where I kept my voice low, hoping not to say something too opinionated that might embarrass him. No, I wasn't the one who should be carrying that word anymore. I was done with that legacy. But others weren't. The ripple effects began quietly. My cousin, the one who used to parrot my father's worst beliefs, messaged me out of the blue. "Hey, I saw that pic your son posted. About the DNA. That's wild. Guess I have some stuff to think about." I didn't expect it. I didn't even fully trust it. But I thanked him anyway, because it meant the truth was doing something. The following Sunday, Ethan and I sat with the kids on our back porch. They were playing a trivia game on his phone. Something science-based, naturally. My youngest kept raising his hand like he was on a game show, giggling at his own buzzers and wrong answers. Ethan leaned toward me and whispered, "You know your dad would have hated this." I laughed. Yeah. He'd probably say we're raising soft kids. Ethan smirked. Well, then I guess we're doing something right. That night, as the kids got ready for bed, my oldest came to my room holding the framed photo of Grandma Lottie. Can I take this for show and tell? She asked. I blinked. Your teacher wants you to talk about family? Yeah, it's Ancestry Week. I want to tell them about Grandma Lottie and how she's part of our story. I felt something warm and sharp twist in my chest. Of course you can, I said, kissing her forehead. She'd be so proud of you. And in that moment, I realized the revenge I'd been so obsessed with had already been won. Not by humiliating my father. Not by exposing him. But by breaking the cycle. By raising kids who are proud of where they come from, every part of it. By building a home where truth isn't punished, it's honored. A few days later, my mother reached out again, this time with a photo of her and her sister. I hadn't spoken to my aunt in years. Your aunt said you were brave, the message read. She wanted you to know that Lottie was her grandmother too, and she remembers the stories. Attached was a recording, my aunt's voice, soft and aged, telling tales of a woman who was kind, fierce, and smarter than any man who ever tried to tame her. She was proud of being different, my aunt said. She used to say, "They can take my name, but they can't take my blood." I closed my eyes and let those words settle in my bones. This was the revenge I hadn't planned, the kind that heals while it cuts. Not fire and fury, but legacy and truth. And a photo passed from hand to hand that told a story no one could ever bury again. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, staring at the stack of letters I had pulled from the attic. They were old, yellowed, and tied with a ribbon, ones my mother had written to her grandmother Lottie as a child. Most were never sent, maybe because of shame, maybe because she'd been told to forget. I untied the ribbon and read, "Dear Grandma Lottie, Daddy says we don't talk about you anymore. But I found your photo and I think you're beautiful. I wish I could know you. I wish you could teach me how to be strong like you." I pressed the paper to my chest. I had grown up with a version of my mother that was silenced, bent, made smaller. Now, through her childlike handwriting, I was meeting the little girl who once longed for answers too. That afternoon, I invited her over. For the first time in months. She came quietly, nervously, hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan like she was still afraid to take up space. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," she said. I shrugged. "We've both got things to unlearn." We sat down in the living room and I handed her the stack of letters. As she opened them, I saw her hand tremble. "You kept these?" she asked. "You kept them," I corrected gently. "You just buried them." She read each one, then looked at me with eyes that were softer, redder. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For letting him talk to you that way. For pretending it was normal." There was a long pause. "I think I was scared of losing his love," she said. "And now, I see I lost yours." "You didn't lose it," I replied, voice steady. "But you do have to earn back my trust." She nodded. "That's fair." I offered her tea. She accepted. It was a small start, but a real one. Later that evening, Ethan and I were folding laundry when he brought it up again. "Have you thought about sending your story in somewhere?" he asked. "It's powerful." I hesitated. "I don't know. It's personal. And I don't want to be known for this. But it's also truth. And truth deserves light." I glanced toward our bookshelf where the framed DNA charts were now kept. Once used for confrontation, now reframed as evidence of reclamation. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe silence wasn't just survival. Maybe it was inherited. And maybe I was the one meant to break that. Not for recognition. Not for applause. But for every little girl who ever wrote a letter to a grandmother she was told to forget. That night, I began drafting the story. Not for revenge. For remembrance. Word about the DNA reveal spread like wildfire through the extended family. Cousins, aunts, uncles. Everyone suddenly had something to say. Some were curious. Some were skeptical. A few were downright offended that family business had been aired so publicly. That's when my wife got the text. "Dinner. Sunday. Everyone's invited." We're talking this through. It was from her mother. She groaned when she read it aloud. This is going to be a circus. Want to skip it? I asked. She shook her head. No. I think it's time they all see the mess their silence has protected. Sunday rolled around faster than we expected. When we walked into her parents' house, the air was tense, like a thunderstorm waiting to break. The living room was packed. Her cousins eyed me cautiously. Her father stood stiffly in the corner, refusing to make eye contact. Then her mother cleared her throat. Before this turns into yelling, we're going to hear everyone out. That sounded diplomatic. It wasn't. It turned into yelling within 10 minutes. Someone's uncle made a joke about fake science, which my daughter immediately countered by reciting how genetic markers are passed down and how small percentages still mattered. My son, bless his teenage confidence, chimed in. I guess I'm the only one here who actually reads. Her father finally snapped. Why are we still talking about this? It doesn't change anything. My wife stepped forward then, calm but firm. It does change something, she said. It changes the way we understand ourselves, and how we've been treating people who didn't look like us. All those years of superiority, based on what, Dad? He had no answer, just red cheeks and silence. Then her aunt, the family historian of sorts, stood up and said something that made everyone go quiet. You know, Grandma's mother was listed as mulatto in a census back in 1910. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe it wasn't. Everyone turned to stare. And just like that, the room tilted. What started as a confrontation became something else entirely. A reckoning. A tearing down of an old narrative. The kind of evening where no one leaves unchanged. After dinner, as we drove home in silence, my wife reached for my hand. Thank you, she whispered, for standing with me through this. I squeezed her fingers and smiled. It's your truth too. All I did was shine a light on it. She chuckled. Well, and printed out color-coded DNA charts. Hey, never underestimate the power of full-color science, I grinned. We didn't fix the family that night, but we cracked it open. And sometimes that's the only way new roots grow. The weeks that followed were oddly quiet. Too quiet. It wasn't just her father who went radio silent. A lot of the extended family had retreated into what I like to call the Great Southern Denial. No one was posting in the family group chat. No one was sharing photos. Birthdays passed with a single generic, happy birthday text instead of the usual 47 gift parade. But under the silence, things were shifting. Her cousin Melissa messaged out of the blue. Hey, I ordered a DNA test. Just curious now. Then another relative. So, Grandma's mom might have been black? How did we not know? Little by little they were waking up. Not to the racial implications necessarily, that would take time, but to the realization that their perfectly packaged family history had cracks. And those cracks were real, and human, and worth exploring. Meanwhile, her father was busy pretending none of it ever happened. He still watched football, still grilled steaks, still called me the foreigner, behind my back probably. But he stopped correcting our son when he said, my Congolese ancestors. He stopped making comments about immigrants. And most telling of all, he stopped arguing. Because that was the real victory. He knew. He knew we had proof. He knew the silence wasn't protecting him anymore. And most of all, he knew his worldview had taken a hit that no amount of denial could fully repair. And I knew something too. I knew I didn't need his approval anymore. I never did. But it felt good to watch that pedestal he built for himself crumble. Our daughter started a school project on genealogy. She asked if she could present our family DNA charts to her class. We said yes. Our son volunteered to join the school's diversity council. And my wife. She finally stopped apologizing for being between cultures. She was owning all of it. The roots, the branches, the parts that didn't fit the Southern Baptist mold. One night, as we were lying in bed, she turned to me and said, Do you think your DNA test was fate? I smiled. No, just good science. She rolled her eyes, laughing. You're such a nerd. Hey, I said, pulling her closer. This nerd cracked open a century of denial. She kissed my forehead. Yeah, you kinda did. And in the quiet that followed, I felt it again. Not victory exactly, but something deeper. Peace. We didn't burn bridges. We just turned on the light and watched the roaches scatter. Years later, we were at my daughter's high school graduation when it hit me just how far we'd come. There we were, me, my wife, our 2 kids, seated front row, her father just a few feet away. He looked older now, quieter, worn around the edges, like someone who had spent years carrying beliefs too heavy for any real soul to sustain. But he clapped. He smiled. And when our daughter walked across the stage with her hair curled like her mama's and a sash reading Diversity Council President across her gown, he stood. He stood for the granddaughter whose ancestry he once would have denied. And he didn't look around to see who else stood. He just did it. Maybe out of pride, maybe out of guilt, but he stood. After the ceremony, our daughter came running up to us. "Did you see him?" she asked. Papa stood. "I saw," my wife whispered, eyes misty. "I saw." We took pictures, ate too much barbecue, and when we finally packed up to leave, her father came over. He didn't say much. Just looked at me, nodded, and patted our son on the back. "You got good kids," he said. My wife looked stunned. "Thanks," I replied. "We think so too." And that was it. Not an apology, not a complete transformation. But in a family like hers, a simple compliment was the equivalent of fireworks. That night, as we sat on the porch watching the sun go down, my wife leaned her head against my shoulder. "You think we changed him?" she asked. I thought for a second. Maybe not entirely, but we forced him to reckon with truth. That's something. "Do you think he loves them now, our kids, unconditionally?" "I think he doesn't have a choice." She smiled. "Good." I pulled her close. "You know, I didn't just do that DNA test for me." She looked at me. "Why did you?" "I did it for us. For truth. And for the people after us who deserve to know who they are." She nodded. "Legacy." "Exactly." Our son stepped onto the porch with an envelope in hand. "Hey, I just got into the summer science camp. The one with the genetics workshop." We cheered. We hugged. And in that moment, I realized this story, our story, had grown far beyond her father, his ignorance, or even me. It was now a seed in our children. One rooted in truth, watered by resilience, and reaching toward a future where identity wasn't something to be denied, but something to be celebrated. And that was the best revenge of all.